We have wounded lying around here, and I don't want them to be hit by the ammo crates. I hovered, not looking at anything in particular, just noticing the different shades of black. Muzzle flashes began to twinkle from the hillside. The low RPM warning siren blared. I glanced at the dial and saw the needle dropping fast. The ship was sinking into the trees. If we didn't drop that ammo, we'd go down. "We've got to drop the ammo," said Niven. "No, you're right over the wounded Delta 6. Delta 6's last broadcast was filled with the crackling noise of rifle fire. Were we or weren't we going to drop the fucking ammo?" I moved a little further to the right. The crew chief and the grunts had the boxes poised at the edge of the deck, but it was still wrong. A treetop rose up, brushing the nose. That was it. If we didn't go now, we'd be joining the men below us in pieces. The shuddering Huey resisted as I tried to move forward. The warning siren blared. I was on the verge of quitting. Moving forward was real effort. I heard a loud slap as the rotor hit a treetop. I couldn't climb. If anything, I had to descend to get the rotor speed back to normal. I turned to the right, getting a little power bonus that way, and dragged the skids across the treetops. Within a few feet, I was able to drop down the side of the knoll into the black ravine. "Now what?" asked Niven. "I'm going to go down the end of the ravine, circle back, and try it again." She says, "We're too heavily loaded." "Yeah, but I think I know where he wants it now." So Niven called Delta 6. "Thank you," said the grateful voice. As I cruised slowly toward the knoll, the muzzle flashes began. Then a tongue of tracers flitted off to our left. Apparently we were hard to see because we hadn't been hit yet. From the conversation during the first attempt, I had the feeling where Delta 6 was and where he wanted us to drop the ammo. "That's it," he yelled. "Hold it right there." I stopped the ship, and as she sank towards the trees, Delta 6 called, "Okay, dump them." With much scraping and bumping, the boxes were shoved from the ship. They dropped 75 feet through the branches and leaves. The ship gained power as it lightened. "Great job," yelled Delta 6. "Nobody was hit. Great job. Thank you, Prospector." I hit one more treetop on the way out, bounced towards the ravine, and accelerated. 10 minutes later, we were back at H Quarter being credited with saving their lives. Delta 6 and his men had fired the last of their ammo to cover us. In the same area, I flew with another guy named Sky King. Sky King told me later that he didn't believe we were going to make it. The clearing was a tight circle cut out of a stand of saplings, and the grunts had put too many wounded on board for us to hover. To top it off, we were under continuous fire. What I did was considered reckless. The solution was automatic. The ship lost RPM in a 1-foot hover. I could not leave anyone behind because men were dying, and we were surrounded by 15-foot bushes and saplings. But we were on a hill. My instincts told me that if I could get through the barrier, the ship could dive down the side of the hill and we could fly. So while Sky King advised me that we would have to drop at least one man, I shook my head and headed for the thinnest section of the vegetable wall. Luckily, the rotors are so high above the ground that they had to cut only the thinner tops of the saplings. Our nose forced through the branches and leaves, the skids tugging on clinging things, and the rotors exploded into the stuff. It sounded like we were crashing. Men screamed in the back of the ship, but even as we struggled through the trees and leaves and bushes, the ground dropped beneath us. The rotors cleared the tops, and we were dragging the fuselage to the last of the foliage. We burst out of the thicket in a swirl of debris, a turbine-powered brush cutter, and I sailed down the side of the hill, picked up some airspeed, and then climbed out. Sky King said, "I don't fucking believe it." I laughed. I was surprised myself. Near the end of June, I got very twitchy. Being a short-timer made life difficult. It would almost be better not to know when you were due to return. As the day drew closer, only 50 days to go, the possibility of dying seemed more imminent, like I had already used up my brakes and would be getting it any day now. Somewhere between now and the day I left was the mission. Probably a typical little mission, light fire, and just one little stray bullet would go through my forehead. Nights were hell. Even with the tranquilizers Dr. Vinci gave me, I kept snapping awake at unseen dangers. Daytime was fine when I flew. The ice business we ran also kept me busy. But when I wasn't flying, a few hours between missions or a day off, I grew morose. Nothing that I saw convinced me that we were doing the right thing in Vietnam. I even harbored sympathy for the enemy, which made me feel guilty. The local war, the one I was in, went on every day. I was part of it. In the air, I did my job the best I knew how. I flew as did all the pilots into hot LZs because in the middle of the confusion, the hazy principles over which the war was fought disappeared. Everything else was excluded. Even I was excluded. When Deacon finally let Gary and me, Gary was a classmate of mine, our first mission was to resupply a small patrol in the jungle. We used off-course navigation to find them, a method that wasn't taught in flight school. Monk had taught me about it. In standard dead reckoning, you corrected a plotted course for wind drift, but you never knew which way to look when you'd flown long enough to be at your target. You're plotting a course, the wind's coming from here, you fly a length of time. Which side of that line is the target going to be? You don't know if you're accurate or not. The wind drift correction was a calculation. The actual track you made was off to one side or the other, but which side? In off-course navigation, you don't correct for wind drift. You fly the magnetic course you plotted on the map for the length of time you calculated, and then you know where to look, upwind. We found our resupply target without incident. After lunch, a firefight broke out close to the airstrip near where we had left the Arvinds that day. There were casualties and the men needed ammo. Gary and I made it into a tiny clearing cut on a ledge. There was just enough room to squeeze the rotors in, leaving the tail hanging over space. The grunts threw some of their wounded on board, gunfire began crackling, and the grunts waved vigorously for us to leave. Takeoff of such a Nook is backwards. As the nose and the rotors clear the obstruction, you push the right pedal, and the whole machine pivots as it's flying so that the nose and tail trade places, putting you back to a normal position, and that's what I did. At the hospital pod, the medics had the wounded off in seconds. Gary and I took off to go back for a second load. Damn, they said the whole damn area was secure weeks ago, Gary complained. They must have not have told Charlie, I said. That's the truth. The unit told us to wait. There was a small firefight going on. I circled high over the valley out of small arms range. From the orbit, we could see some smoke up in the north where we had worked that morning. To the west was more smoke from some 101st units who were moving in that direction. The Americans were working a very large section of territory, but from up high it seemed very small. The sea of jungle stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction, and you could go anywhere you wanted under that canopy. Okay, Prospector, we're secure. Roger, we're on our way, called Gary. From the orbit, I dropped toward the peak of the hill, dropped below it, and settled into a descent along a ravine that led to the Nook. We had picked up a load of ammo on the way and could barely hover at this altitude. I had to time the approach so that I lost translational lift as the ship moved on to the ledge. When we were moving at maybe 30 miles an hour, with 100 yards to go, our right door gun exploded. The gunner had seen muzzle flashes within 50 feet. With 50 feet to go, the most critical part of the approach, the ground guide started waving me away. This was no place to stop. I kept coming. Then two more men jumped up and waved me away. At the same time, a voice on the radio yelled, "Don't land, we're under heavy fire." This was a new one for me. Normally I could just fly over the LZ if we had to abort, but this one was on the side of a hill, enclosed on both sides by the ravine. I couldn't turn away either, but there was space behind and below us. I flared the ship to stop the approach, and since it couldn't hover, it began to sink. Nose high, the ship tail slid down into the ravine. As we fell, I used the right pedal to bring the nose around, but I let it continue to fall to get airspeed. I accelerated into the ravine. The airspeed came up to about 70. Then we were a flying machine again, and I swooped up between some trees on the ridge beside the ravine. The grunts had seen us tumbling into the ravine. We disappeared as the ravine turned, and they thought we'd crashed. But lo, the Huey jumped up out of the jungle again, to their amazement. We finally got back to the Nook, dropped the ammo, and picked up the rest of the wounded. As usual with the last trip, some dead men also rode back with us. So by the time I finished, this is 50 days ago, by the time I completed my tour in Vietnam, I was a pretty damn good pilot, but I was also, my nerves were shot, which leads me to patience is going to take, what effect did this have on me when I came home? That's the question. So I actually covered this in a book I wrote called Chicken Hawk Back in the World, which a friend of mine reviewed it as saying, Chicken Hawk Back in the World is a litany of fuck-ups that make you happy you're not Mason. And it's startling, even for me to read, how messed up I was when I came back. But I'm going to let patience take over and explain how it was from the other side when I got back.
I'm sure you can all see why I like him. When he first came back, I asked Bob about what made people brave, what made them risk their lives to go in under fire to get the wounded when they didn't have to. I figured it must be some glorious feeling. I still remember his answer. You're tired all the time from flying too many hours. You're tired all the time from flying too many hours, and someone comes up on the radio needing help. You don't think about it, you just do it. It's not courage, it's your job. He looked at me to see if I understood. So I said, what about all those medals then? He'd been recommended for 2 DFCs and had a Bronze Star and a lot of air medals with a little V on them for valor. Yeah, he said, they should be called the Too Tired to Give a Crap with V device. So, when he went to Vietnam, I'm just going to read some things from here, and then I'll take questions later or whatever. When he went to Vietnam, Bob was an optimistic, idealistic person who could do anything, work any job. At 17, he'd gotten a private pilot's license, working 5 jobs to pay for his lessons while he was in high school. He joined the Army in 1964 to learn how to fly helicopters. 3 months after he graduated from flight school, the first Cav sailed for Vietnam, and he sailed with it. I still have a picture of him I took the day he left, with 1-year-old Jack tucked underneath his arm, both of them smiling. His face is young and enthusiastic. He's skinny but handsome, carried about 140 pounds on his 5'11" frame. When he got back, Bob weighed 119 pounds. As a combat helicopter pilot flying almost every day, toward the end of his tour, he had been given tranquilizers, quite illegally, to help him sleep. He flew combat assaults up to the last day. I'm not kidding about that. The last day he was going to fly a combat assault and somebody took his place. He had lost 15% of his body weight. He'd always been thin, but now he looked as if he'd been in a death camp. His wrists looked enormous, his eyes glittered, he was honed down. That night, a loud smack like that woke me. I swear I could see between Bob and the bed, he was so far above it. The smack was the sound of his snapping awake. He didn't make anywhere near as much noise when he landed. This was to be his pattern of sleep for the next 10 years. It became a family joke. Daddy's levitating again. Not only could he not sleep, but he was also very restless and smoked like a chimney. For about a month, he flicked ashes and butts on the floor. It surprised both of us every time he did it. Sorry, he'd say. You have to realize I spent a year living in a tent. I thought it was pretty funny. I was so glad to have him back, but I really had no idea what he had been through. I was deathly afraid of palmetto bugs, those big cockroaches we have in Florida. And I'd scream when I saw one and want him to kill it. He'd spend a year carrying guys with their legs blown off and their brains blown out, body bags, grunts who didn't even make it to the edge of the LZ, and now he had to deal with someone who screamed when she saw a bug. He would get up, catch the cockroach, and put it outside. I've seen enough things killed, he finally explained. And then the next thing I want to read Bob wrote me every day from Vietnam. Once he wrote that he was surprised to be alive, but usually he told funny stories about the Army or just said he loved me. In one letter written after he'd been there 8 months, he counted up the days he hadn't flown, 10. He was sent to the 48th Aviation Company 3 months before he came home. The stories got funnier, but he wrote that they had to start giving him tranquilizers so he could sleep. We moved to Texas, where he taught at the U.S. Army Primary Helicopter School. For a while, he even flew 2 shifts, training guys in the H-23 in the morning and the TH-55 in the afternoon. Bob began to have dizzy spells at Fort Walters. He was grounded twice and finally sent to Fort Sam Houston to be evaluated. He came home with $1 million piece of paper that said he had combat fatigue and could never be sent back to a combat zone. He also came back with a look on his face that I will never forget as long as I live. There are kids there, patients, he said. Fort Sam was the burns treatment center for the Army. 18-year-old kids with their faces burnt off from napalm. They aren't ever going to look any better, and they have their whole lives in front of them. When his obligation to the Army was completed, he left a grounded and, in his eyes, useless pilot. We went back to school at the University of Florida. He studied fine arts. I worked and took English courses. Bob went to the VA for the Valium the Army had started him on and was declared a 50% disabled veteran for nervousness. He had all the symptoms for which he would have been rated 100% disabled for PTSD, except that the diagnosis didn't exist until 1980. The next few years were chaotic. Although we both finished college, we moved almost every year and we played musical jobs. If he had one, I didn't, and vice versa. For some of those years, Bob drank a quart of whiskey a day, smoked pot, and took a lot of Valium, and he was still wired. He couldn't sleep, he had nightmares, rages, constant anxiety attacks with irregular heartbeat, chest pains, dizzy spells, and incapacitating weakness. He had intrusive thoughts and deep depressions. He alternated between thinking he was nuts, telling me I was nuts, driving like a wild man with me and Jack in the car, riding his motorcycle like a madman. Often he was cold and critical or angry and critical. He was unfaithful to me. He left various jobs for both reasonable and unreasonable reasons. Neither of us knew what was wrong. I screamed and raged and enabled and took care of the family stuff while he suffered, I suffered, and Jack suffered. Jack became a very tense little boy, and he took care of me when Bob couldn't. Most of the time, Bob just wasn't there emotionally, but sometimes in the midst of all this chaos, it would be okay between us, and sometimes it would even be beautiful. And let's see. About 1980, he got out in 1968, so this is 12 years after he got out of the Army. At the Gainesville VA, they had what they called bus therapy. We'll give you pills, but if you want to talk to somebody, you can take the bus up to Jacksonville to the vet center, or you can take the bus over to Tallahassee to the vet center. So he actually took the bus up to Jacksonville one time, and they gave him a pamphlet, Readjustment Problems Among Vietnam Veterans. It was a free pamphlet available from the disabled American veterans, and it helped me understand what had happened to Bob. As a matter of fact, I cried all the way through it as aspect after aspect of my life with Bob was played in a framework of normal reaction to trauma. All those years I spent trying to understand and cope alone, all those problems I tried to shoulder, often failing miserably, had an explanation. We weren't defective, crazy, fucked up. We were normal. We had struggled for years without help, almost without hope, bound by love that would not give up despite the pain, but what we had was definable and helpable. I'm crying now as I write this, self-pity, I admit, at the waste of 20 years of my life struggling with a problem I didn't understand. I'm crying for all my pain, for all those times I felt that if only I were better, thinner, more housewifely, neater, kinder, Bob wouldn't be so depressed all the time. If I were a perfect wife, he wouldn't have any problems. Now I'm laughing because he used to agree with me. But I'll tell you something else. If I didn't cry over it, I wouldn't be able to laugh over it a moment later. So for other spouses, if you have lost years, I urge you to cry over them. It's part of your job in getting over them. It's your duty to cry. And I wasn't exactly an angel. This is one short paragraph I wrote about the way I was. I look back at the time when Bob had severe PTSD and was drinking a quart of whiskey a day and smoking pot and taking Valium and was still wired. I know he couldn't talk to me. I was too busy telling him what a shit he was and running the family, running out to buy his booze, making dinner while he fixated on the war reports on TV. Somehow I was always busy cooking during the news, so while he slowly died inside watching people die for real year after year, I made spaghetti, chicken cordon bleu, chicken with almonds. I don't like to remember this. It doesn't fit in with the way I would like to have been, the way I'd like to be now, but it's the truth. So far I've been talking as though the veteran's the only one with problems, but his problems can become your biggest problem, and it can wear you out. What can you do if you're at the end of your rope? How do you find the strength to go on? I can tell you how I find it. I think about the year Bob spent in Vietnam. Whatever else he could have done, he endured something I'll never have to. Even if he had shot himself in the foot or turned in his wings, he would have still done something very difficult, something that I've never had to face. I try to understand how small civilian concerns must seem compared to life or death in Vietnam. That gives me perspective. If he could do that, then I can do this. Stand by him. I remember the look on Bob's face when I first said to him, when I was writing this book, that I thought I had probably, notice the hedging, been hard to live with, too, and that he had a lot to put up with, too. And yet every time I repeat this statement, I realize more deeply how true it is, how hard it must have been to live with someone who screamed at roaches when he was seeing bloody corpses in his mind, how hard to live with someone who possessed and clung to tons of things when he knew that their value compared to that of human life was nothing. How hard to live with someone who was always right, who let everyone know in subtle and unsubtle ways what she had to put up with. Someone who was always pointing out what was wrong with him and how to fix it. Now I see the tremendous double-bind perfect patience who was far from perfect, the earnest, helpful know-it-all put my family in when I was doing that stuff, and how hard life was for all of us. Working on myself has made it a lot easier on Bob because it's lifted the burden of being the defective one off his shoulders and put it where we can share it, as partners should. If you can, don't take his problems personally. This is a hard one. When someone is screaming in your face or has let you down again, or is just not there when you need him physically or emotionally, or is screwing around again, it's hard not to take it personally. It's hard not to feel you caused this somehow, even though you didn't. Still, he is not having these problems to hurt you, although they do hurt you. Whatever he is doing is not part of a private vendetta against you, although it feels that way. Bad feelings overwhelm him, and his pain comes out splattered all over you because you're closest to him and the easiest target, but it's shrapnel from the war. After a horrendous fight in which I'd screamed, "How am I supposed to think you love me when you treat me like this?" He looked at me with utter shock on his face and said, "But you know I love you. You're my wife." or "I married you, didn't I?" or something like that. He sounded really surprised, too. I realized that in some dumb way, he did expect me to know that he did love me, no matter what rotten things he said. You can try to see the things your vet is able to do for you with new eyes. It's hard on a person if he can never be right. When I was able to accept what Bob had to give rather than stay mad over whatever it was I thought he should have known I wanted him to do, we got along better. I'm not a religious person, but I think the parable of the widow's mite in the Bible is a good example to us. The widow gave a penny, but she gave more than the rich man because it was everything she had. Our guys don't have much to give when they are wrapped up in the pain of Vietnam or any other war. But what they do give is worth more than the easy generosity of a man who has everything and has never had to go without or had to kick someone in the face in order to live. You just have to be aware, to be able to see what they are giving. When Bob used to come up behind me once a year and hug me and say in my ear that he loved me, I used to weep with joy. It meant so much because it was so rare. Our vets may not be able to give us what we were brought up to expect or want, but sometimes what they can give is better. And then part of my book is explaining how I started to get better, and one of the things I did was I learned how to listen. Now, that sounds ridiculous, but most people spend 20 seconds listening to anybody that's speaking to them, and then they start composing their own reply. And it's usually advice or correction or whatever. In my family, it was always correction. No, you're wrong. That's what we did. So I learned how to paraphrase. What if what you learn when you paraphrase is painful? What if it scares both of you? I can't write, Bob would often say when I got home. I used to feel like saying, you can write. Viking is paying you to write, you dummy. You got an advance. All the old fact marshaling and advice giving and trying to control. I felt like saying, just do it. You can do it. I know you can. I believe in you. Rah, rah, encouragement. What a way to give somebody writer's block. Bob had feelings about writing he needs to let go of. That's what talking about feelings does for anyone. It releases them. They may come back often, but they're not as strong. The person who is heard with concern and without advice becomes aware that one way to let feelings go so they don't keep you stuck is to talk about them. It's really hard, I would paraphrase. You have to produce a book and you want it to be really good. Yeah, everything depends on me, he'd say. I don't know if I can do it. You might fuck it up, I'd say. That's a straight paraphrase. Yeah, the stuff I wrote today is bad. Lousy, huh? Straight paraphrase. Drivel. Worries you, doesn't it? Paraphrasing the feeling rather than the words. Yeah, things don't come out right. Besides, no one will ever read it. All this effort will be for nothing. Another straight paraphrase. Right. There'd be a long pause. The distress would seem to run out of him. Want to read what I wrote? I listened to him feel that he couldn't do it, that it was too hard, that what he wrote was shit, and that no one would read it. Now, I had read this book called Parent Effectiveness Training, which I got when Jack turned 14, because I thought it would effectively teach him how to obey me. And instead it said, listen and let him find his own solutions. Before I read Parent Effectiveness Training, I would have found those feelings totally unacceptable and actually terrifying. At every point in that conversation, most people, especially me before I read PET, would have forbidden him to feel those feelings through one of a number of methods. Advice, just do it. Warning, you better get going. You owe them a book. Cheering up, you write so well. Bob would still have written the same great book, but it would have been harder because he wouldn't have had the strength being listened to gives. And I would have lost many, many chances to become more intimate with him. I wouldn't have understood what he was going through if I hadn't let him tell me. Maybe italics aren't enough to emphasize how important I think that sentence is. It ought to be in red. That's the essence of intimacy, letting someone tell you how he feels. I was plenty scared when Bob would say he couldn't write. I didn't want to clean houses all my life. But feelings are ephemeral. Expressing them sends them on the way, not permanently, but long enough to get on with something else. Bob had plenty of legitimate reasons for his feelings. No Vietnam book had ever sold very well. Usually first books don't sell well either. He felt badly because I was working as a cleaning woman, even though I had finished college, because that's where I could make the most money. So then I was getting pretty good at paraphrasing. There's another problem. For years after I learned active listening and paraphrasing, every time I'd tell Bob a worry, he'd give me advice. I just want to punch him in the nose. It really burned me up that he was not reciprocating, but it was one of the prices I was willing to pay because I love him, and because he pays prices for me I'm only vaguely aware of, like the fact that I'm such a know-it-all. Anyhow, I discovered an explanation for this behavior that lowered my desire to punch him. Aha, men are solution-oriented. I just have to make it plainer that I want him to listen to my feelings and I don't need a solution. I learned to say exactly what I need. Bob, please let me whine and snivel a while about this, okay? He likes my sense of humor. And the last thing I'm going to read, having practiced paraphrasing in a non-judgmental way for 5 years, when I started writing this book, I was able to listen actively to the veterans I interviewed for this book. Some of the stuff they told me was more than painful. For some of them, it seemed to be a relief. Others went home and had nightmares for weeks afterwards. I also felt some of them could talk to me only because I wasn't going to be around after the interview. The thing that struck me as we talked, and I paraphrased, and we went from the superficial to the fundamental, was their pain, real anguish. Talking to me hurt, and yet they were willing to do it to help their fellow vets. To me and to you as you read, it's all stories. The first third of this book is about Vietnam. I interviewed 60 vets, all different jobs. To me and to you as you read, it's all stories. We can visualize Vietnam, but it isn't imprinted on your mind's eye. When I said to a former officer, "You feel responsible," in response to his look of anguish, as he told me of one of his men losing his legs grading the side of a road to nowhere, I was able to understand what he feels, maybe even to feel it a bit. But I don't see the explosion as he does. I don't hear the screams. I don't wait by the guy for the medevac blaming myself. I haven't lived with this for 16 years. It still hurts him, and seeing it hurts me. If I hurt this much at the abstract knowledge of just a single tragedy, how does it feel to have seen it, done it, been it? When I started writing this book, I thought I was going to write a book on how to take care of your veteran so that he could be happy. And I got into 12-step programs instead and learned that what I needed to do was to let him find his own solutions. And I had become quite messed up. I don't know if you realize that from hearing what I wrote about being bossy and thinking I knew everything and stuff like that. And whenever I talk to veterans' wives, I always say, if this guy is driving you nuts, you probably are just a tiny little bit nuts. I certainly was. And I want to tell you a little bit about my take on PTSD. To me, PTSD is a normal reaction to war. It's not weak, it's not weird, although people who have it usually feel nuts. Bob certainly did. The symptoms start out as built-in survival skills. They are built into everybody's brain. Everybody has the capacity to do whatever it takes to survive. But those same survival skills can become your biggest problems. And if you live with somebody who has those survival skills, you are probably going to personalize them and misunderstand them. And one of the things on my website is called The War at Home. It explains that a little better, or a little more thoroughly, let me put it that way. For me, PTSD is not the problem. The problem is war. And PTSD is a solution to the problem of war. It proves that you have courage, initiative, luck, perseverance, endurance, strength, speed, etc. You lived. Dead people don't get PTSD. So if you got PTSD, you lived. There are 4 causes of PTSD, only one of which is in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and that one is traumatic stressors. When people try to kill you, when you see somebody you care for killed or injured, when you lose your home or community, or when you see anyone, even somebody you don't know, that's recently been seriously injured or killed by violence. Those are traumatic stressors. The second one is your brain evolved to keep you alive. So you have these abilities built in. The third one is you're a human being. That's why you get PTSD. And the fourth one is you care, or you wouldn't get numb. You may be so numb now that you don't think you care about anything, but you wouldn't have to be numb if you didn't care. And the symptoms are direct evidence of what you have been through. So if you're thinking, my husband is such a jerk, he doesn't feel anything, blah, 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 that's evidence that he went through something that made him shut down. So I always tell people to look at the evidence. 3 things built into your brain: attention to threat, the ability to act instantly, and constant wariness are the roots of the symptom of hypervigilance, which also has anger in it. And hypervigilance is very effective when you're in a war zone. When you're home, it's not so effective. And it can become your biggest problem because you start seeing threats everywhere where there are no threats. Now, the roots of numbing are your brain's designed to rapidly adapt to whatever's going on. So something that's terrible the first time it happens, it's every day by the third. So you rapidly adapt to any threat and to any situation, which enables you to act. But numbing, which helps you in a war zone, can lead to the fact that you can't feel anything when your mother dies, which is pretty normal for a veteran because they're so numb. And they avoid anything that will make them feel, except maybe adrenaline. They don't mind that feeling really wired up. Anger is another thing that helps you not feel. So anger goes through both of these, both the hypervigilance and the numbing. And the final part of it is the brain is a better safe than sorry system. And it does not speak English, and it cannot tell time, the part of the brain that is reacting. So that part of your brain leads to re-experiencing because it does not want you to make the same mistake or to forget that people are dangerous and that there might be a bomb under that package on the road. So, but 20 years later, when you're still looking for bombs by the side of the road, people are going to be annoyed with you. For family members, there's 3 C's. We think we caused it. That's what I did. Every time he was depressed or angry or whatever, I thought it was my fault. And quite often he agreed with me. Because we didn't know anything about PTSD. There was no such thing in those days. Nobody had ever heard of it. So I had to learn to let go of that and find compassion, concern, and caring for him. And like I said before, if he's driving you crazy, you might be a little bit nuts. I certainly was. So now I'm open for questions.
I really think it can be good. Military could be good training for the right person. You can pick up some really good skills. I learned how to fly. So I'm not against the military or joining the military. I have opinions about how the military was used, but that doesn't have anything to do with me joining it. So
my answer is a little different. If you join the military thinking that the military will teach you how to take care of yourself and value you and never waste you, it's not true. What you find out in the first firefight is you're expendable, and they are willing to expend you. And I think that's really terrible. And then if you manage to live through the period that you're in the military and you have some of the effects of war like most people do, right now they are throwing people out of the military with what they call personality disorders, which they don't have. They have PTSD. They're throwing people out with bad conduct discharges who have PTSD and are acting out their PTSD. They're not taking care of people the way they said they would. And they're doing their best not to find any PTSD because it costs money. That is the cost of war. You have to take care of these people. During the 50th anniversary celebrations of the Second World War, World War II veterans who had never gone to the VA started pouring in with PTSD because they were now so old they couldn't drink themselves to sleep every night. They weren't working anymore, and their wife might be dying, all of those being losses that brought up what they lost in the war. And one of the proudest moments of my life, I distributed an article called PTSD and Holidays. And a woman who ran a World War II combat veterans group wrote me that her World War II combat veterans had their first good Christmas since 1945 after she read that to them and gave it to them. War keeps on hurting. It's a gift that keeps on giving. And, I think it's noble to want to join the military. But don't kid yourself that they're going to take care of you, because they're not. Anybody else?
They'll pay for your college.
That's true. They will pay for your college. When Bob got back from Vietnam, they paid him $125 a month to go to college because he had a wife and kid. And that didn't even pay tuition, but they did send him to college. You guys get a little better deal, I think.
I'm lazy. Making up my mind not to write a novel, but to write, making up my mind not to write a novel, but to write memoirs, because I'd always wanted to be a writer anyway. I wrote stories when I was in high school and college. But I wanted to combine all the adventures of my friends in Vietnam, because I didn't think I had done anything very spectacular, and I wanted to put all these stories and make a really good adventure novel. But a friend of mine, who was a famous writer at the time, named Martin Cruz Smith, wrote Gorky Park and a bunch of other books. He's a friend of mine. He invited me to come to lunch with his agent. And his agent, I told him I wanted to write a novel about Vietnam. He says, well, what'd you do there? Tell me what you did. So I started telling my stories. He says, you know, if you tell your story like you're telling me now, that's what you should write. And then Bill said the same thing, and Patience said the same thing, so I dropped the novel. So once I had made up my mind, I actually drew up a contract, one piece of paper, so I will do this for a year, and if it doesn't work at the end of the year, I'll quit, but I will be at my desk every morning for 3 hours, whether I write or not, et cetera, et cetera. I laid out all the job requirements, and I stuck to it. And when I set my first 100 pages up to that agent, he said, send me 100 more. I sent him 100 more. He says, well, I'm going to take this around and see if I can sell it before it's finished. And he did. He sold it to fifth try to Viking Penguin, bought my book based on the first third of the book. But I had to overcome laziness.
After Chicken Hawk came out, a few years later, we were invited up to Rayford, which is a prison, to talk to a Vietnam veterans group. And we went there, and, you know, we were talking, and they asked me how I felt when I found out Bob had screwed around in Vietnam. And I said, well, actually, by then I realized that people were trying to kill him. So I thought he deserved whatever he could get. And they were all like, oh, yeah, I wish you could talk to my wife. And I wished I could talk to their wives. And I realized, actually, on the road between Worthington Springs and High Springs, I realized I could talk to their wives if I wrote a book. So I decided to write this thing. It was going to be called Vietnam, A Woman's Handbook, and it was going to explain everything about Vietnam, why they were so screwed up, and how to take care of them. And luckily, that didn't quite happen. Because first of all, I looked at all the jobs in the Army's book, you know, the MOSs, it was this thick. So I figured I'm not going to be able to do that. And also, I joined a society called the Society for Traumatic Stress Studies. And the first meeting I went to, everybody had read Chicken Hawk, and they were using it with their patients, because if the guy wasn't feeling anything, reading Chicken Hawk would make them feel. And if he was feeling screwed up, knowing that Bob was screwed up made them feel better. So they all liked me. And I was always telling them how Bob was. They'd say, how's Bob? And I'd tell them. And then finally somebody said to me, and who's taking care of patients? And I just burst into tears, because nobody was taking care of patients. I thought that I didn't deserve to be taken care of, or somebody would have been taking care of me. And I didn't know how to do it myself. I had no idea. So she suggested that I go to Al-Anon, which of course I did not do. But she suggested the Al-Anon concept of detachment with love would help. So, you know, I thought, oh, that's nice. And I went back, and I was looking for books. I saw a book about adult children of alcoholics, and I knew that a lot of veterans were drunks. So I figured, I'll read this, because this will help the kids. Well, the first line in the characteristics of an adult child of an alcoholic is, adult children of alcoholics do not know what normal is. Wives of veterans with PTSD do not know what normal is. You get to the point where you don't know it's normal to want to be hugged. You don't know if it's normal to, you know, think somebody should say something nice to you every once in a while or whatever. So I started going to a meeting for adult children of alcoholics. And it really helped me. I started working the 12 steps of AA, in that, you just change a few words so that you're talking about your upbringing instead of alcohol. I thought they were bullshit when I first read them. I mean, where are the directions? Give me some, every self-help book I ever read was like, oh, do this for 3 weeks and you'll be perfect. It wasn't like that in a 12-step program. But it really changed my life, and it helped me to let go of Bob. I'm kind of an atheist, so, made a decision to turn my will and my life over to the care of God as I understand him. But I did turn my will and my life over to the care of Lee Iacocca as I understood him, and he did nothing. He didn't nag Bob or Jack or call them up and see how they were doing or ask if they were depressed, and they did much better. And that was really, really humbling. And then a few months later, I was up to the 10th step, which is continue to take personal inventory, and when we were wrong, promptly admitted it. So Bob said something to me that hurt my feelings. And I had been noticing that in my family, if you felt bad, you found whose fault it was and shamed them and blamed them until you felt better. So I started shaming and blaming him about some tuna fish that was in the refrigerator, because I only made it for him, and he didn't even appreciate what I did. And he said it was too old and he wasn't going to eat it, and he left the room. And then I go, oh my God, 10th step. That was wrong. Shaming and blaming somebody just because you feel bad is not right. So I followed him into the kitchen. He wasn't there, but the tuna fish was thrown out. Then I followed him into his office. And the look on his face when I went into his office was not a happy camper look. And I said something I had never said before, and it came out like this. I said, I was wrong. Just like that. I couldn't even say the words, which made me realize how true it had been. But the other thing it made me realize was he'd noticed I was wrong before, and he still was there. He still loved me. The fact that he was there was circumstantial evidence that he loved me. And I also felt this great big boulder roll off my shoulders, because having to be right is really a lot of work. You've got to make up statistics and twist facts and all that kind of stuff. So it was a great moment of change in my life, and I'm sure he was very grateful when it happened. Oh, and I was also too guilty about his work habits not to work for 3 hours a day myself.
I do. I'm lucky enough to have some friends. Without her, I'd be totally. I have some friends in Florida near where I live who build a single-place small helicopter. It's very well built, and they think I'm some kind of a helicopter hero, so they let me fly anytime I want. They build them out there. So I go out and put one of these things on it. They have a jet-powered one, turbine-powered. It's really cool. So I keep, I'm still pretty good at it. I remember the first time the guy let me fly it, it's single place, so you can't train anybody how to fly it. It's like one. So the guy's brave enough to let me, who hadn't flown, as I was considering, I had not flown solo in a helicopter for 40 years. But I knew in my head that there was no possible way for me to screw this up. It was just so beyond the possibility. I knew it. So I got into this little chopper, and I was brave enough to have somebody videotape me. It's on YouTube. And I made a perfect takeoff and took off. The first thing it did was I flew towards the trees, because that's what I was taught to do in Vietnam. I flew into the trees and ducked around. Pretty soon they'd lost sight of me. Oh my God, And then I came back around, boom, up over through the trees again, and then circled them for a while. I was having a ball. So I still go out there. I fly,
He buzzed the guy.
I buzzed them, yeah. So I'm still pretty good at helicopters.
Tell him about the Huey.
Oh, the Huey. I was, last February, I was invited to talk at the Pima Air Museum. And where is that anyway, Arizona?
Yeah, it's in Arizona.
Arizona. And they wanted to know, would I like to try flying a Huey They had an H model, which was a Vietnam-era Huey. They were going to bring it over, the company that owned it, and see if I could fly it. So I said, sure, I'll give it a try. So the Huey's parked out at the Peabody Air Museum between buildings and stuff, and then wind was 30 knots, not miles per hour, knots. It's fast. So, I'm aware of that, and I'm getting, So I sit in the helicopter next to the IP, and he cranks it up because I have no idea how to crank up a Huey. And then he says, okay, you got it. So I got my hands on the controls again, and they felt perfectly at the right place. The inside of the windshield, the frame, all looked the same, sounded the same. I picked up to a perfect hover. It was so perfect, I looked over to make sure he wasn't flying. And then I did some pedal turns into the gust and stuff, held it steady, set it down again, picked it up again, and then we took off and came back around, did flybys. It had been 47 years since I had touched a Huey Cyclic. The training and the experience makes that kind of stuff indelible. It's true that the best way is really the military. Because you get to fly a real aircraft. Besides, you can't afford to buy the time that it would take, unless you're rich. It costs you $250 an hour to learn to fly a helicopter.